If you're new to the channel or you haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing and turning on the bell notifications. It only takes a little bit of your time and it genuinely helps me a ton. If one were to create the ideal or perfect start to a story, what would it look like? Or at least what would come close? Out of all the things that I've read, I was revisiting it mentally, and I was wondering what story out of all of the ones that I've experienced in the last 2 years or so that I've been reading manga has had the strongest start. And the name that kept popping up in my head over and over again was Death Note. Because I'm Kira. So I decided to revisit the manga a little bit and check out the earlier chapters. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate of the second half of Death Note. That would be its own topic for maybe another video if y'all are interested. But Death Note as a series has been analyzed to death on YouTube, especially regarding Light Yagami's character, the intelligence of these characters, yada yada yada, you get the point. But in this video, I really want to look at Death Note's beginning and what it does from a narrative standpoint that makes it such an early grab. One of the things you really want to do as a writer at the beginning of your story, or at least the goal of every story that I've seen, is to establish the protagonist, the setting, some sort of conflict within the first chapters, and to grasp the audience. And no other story, in my opinion, does this better than Death Note. But why is that? And I think before we actually get into the narrative of Death Note and what it manages to do in a very quick amount of time, I think the context surrounding Death Note is very important. Death Note is one of those stories that is very unorthodox for its demographic. Usually what had been said as mainstream or typical, or even to this day what's typical within shonen, or actually I'd argue in just stories in general, is conflict is resolved physically. So now you present people with a story within a demographic that's heavily dependent on fighting, but yet it's a series that doesn't do that. Instantly, Death Note has the appeal of uniqueness, doing something very different and being very unorthodox within the context of everything else surrounding it. And that's kind of one of the topics that I wanted to get into regarding this video. You see, along with Death Note, there were some other series that had popped into my mind. And when I thought about what made their introductions as stories so intriguing, it's that they were able to not only establish the basics of what every story should establish, the protagonist, the setting, and the possible conflict or threat within the narrative, they're stories that aren't really scared to do something a bit different with its intro. For example, there was a story that I was reading recently, a manhwa, called The Hero Has Returned. And even though later on in the story I'm not the biggest fan of its direction, it starts off by having this typical isekai story, but instead it begins with the hero finishing his mission in the isekai world and now having to return to the real world. And in this first chapter, it establishes that when the character returns to the real world has moved on and it sucks. And so essentially this character goes on a murdering rampage. All of that happens within the first chapter. And in the second chapter is where it then establishes the actual protagonist of the story. Something that is very unorthodox for a story to do, but when I tell you those are some of the 2 best chapters I've ever read, I'm not lying to you. So if you want to check out The Hero's Return, then I'd highly recommend it. Or well, at least the beginning portion. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make, without even getting into anything narrative regarding Death Note really, is that if you were to sell the premise to Death Note to somebody, it's instantly intriguing and it stands out, considering that it's a bit of a subversion of what's typically expected from anime and manga. Now, for an anime watcher or a manga reader, old or new, one of the things that is a little tedious within getting into a story is the story taking a while for it to become interesting, for it to hit its stride and really grasp us with what the story is all about. Death Note doesn't have that issue at all. Now, of course, I'm going to be referencing stuff that happens throughout the story of Death Note, but really quick, I just want to look at the first 5 chapters of Death Note, because if you can grasp a reader within 5 chapters to be completely invested within your story, you've got them. In chapter 1 of Death Note, we're introduced to 2 very important components. The first being the protagonist. The protagonist of the story, Light Yagami, is a character who I will be talking about a little more in depth as the video goes on, but Light seems to be your typical high school student. Again, at this point, so far nothing too different within the world of anime and manga. However, what else is established within this first chapter, and what would continue to, I think, really be an important element to Death Note, is the element of chaos. And that element of chaos is presented through the Shinigami Ryuk. You see, you introduce a character who's clearly more powerful than anything else established in the world of Death Note, and yet he gives this method of chaos, being the Death Note itself, just drops it to a person, which the story establishes early on that is chosen, and yet the motivation of this character, this powerful being, is that it was bored, and it's doing this out of entertainment. Instantly you create a sense of worry within the reader because, well, there's many questions that will pop up in the reader's mind. Is that truly the motivation, or is he simply just lying to Light? Or if he actually is doing this out of boredom, then what is he capable of? What is the rules of what this Shinigami is capable of doing and not doing, and what are the rules surrounding the Death Note? Something that is established within this first chapter, but certain other elements regarding this would be established as the story goes on. So you throw in this element of chaos, with a protagonist who is slightly different from what we would expect. Because instantly in the first chapter, although Light Yagami's motives may seem good, it's very clear that his character has something to be concerned with. And that's when we realize that Light Yagami is doing this out of slight boredom as well. Or at least that's what he says. And his initial reaction to the Death Note seems typical and of worry. But then he has a strong conviction, where he says he'll reign over this new world that he establishes, instantly trying to put himself in the seat of God, which is a characteristic more akin to that of an antagonist, something we would expect from the villain of our story. So where we fall with Light Yagami's morality and where Light Yagami's morality falls into is instantly put into question from the first chapter. So we have our element of chaos introduced with our protagonist, we have a premise that is very different from everything else within its respected context, and now the morality of said protagonist is already being put into question from the very first chapter. And then, if that wasn't far enough, then we instantly are introduced to a mysterious personality at the end of chapter 1, who would end up being the antagonist of our story. So from chapter 1 alone, we're already presented with our protagonist, element of chaos, antagonist, possible moral dilemma, and a whole lot of mysteries and questions. This is then reaffirmed in chapter 2, as in the beginning of chapter 2, it instantly gives a summary of the Death Note, Light Yagami, and Ryuk. And then immediately in chapter 2, we are reaffirmed with Light Yagami's morality and his goal, and we as the reader instantly have to put that into question once again. And what we really get in chapter 2 is the world's reaction to Light Yagami's actions from chapter 1. We get to see the police force and all of the secret agencies really trying to crack down on this, or at least the central one in Japan, and then Light brings up it was the main topic at school as well, and when Light goes to check his computer at home, he sees that they've named this thing Kira, some sort of divine god really bringing its judgment upon the evil in the world. And if you notice something about the author of Death Note, and this is something I realized while reading Platinum's End as well, is the author is very good at facial expressions. And if you notice, for the majority of the story regarding Death Note, Light Yagami is meant to have a cool, calm, and collected appearance. And even though these changes become more apparent as the story goes on, I love noticing the little bit of excitement we really get to see from Light Yagami in this chapter, seeing how people have kind of referred to him now as a god. But getting back to the police force and the special agencies of Japan, we're then told of this person called L, who has been working on the case already. So instantly we're presented with a mysterious force of opposition towards Light Yagami, someone who from the introduction to the story is shown to be on the same level of intelligence and thought, being able to deduce things that most normal people wouldn't. So now that we have our sense of conflict and where it's coming from, how will Light Yagami, this character who's given this godlike power, how would he react to the idea of a challenge, his morality being put into question? And that's instantly answered in chapter 2, as we see a news broadcaster calling him evil, and then we get to see his reaction. You see, in chapter 1, and then once again for a brief moment early on in chapter 2, Light Yagami's morality is put into question. Now it's being put to the test, and he fails miserably, as he then lashes out against this news reporter screaming at the TV, saying that he's righteous, and those that try to oppose him they're the evil ones, as he writes his name frantically in the Death Note, instantly killing this man without any sort of thought. This is where Light Yagami goes from possible anti-hero to the clear-cut villain of the story. And once again, just to make it very clear, because I know some people miss this, villain is not the same as antagonist. And that just adds to the intrigue of Death Note even more, as if the setting and the premise of the story wasn't already different from the context surrounding it. The protagonist is almost nothing like anything we've seen before. A protagonist who is the clear-cut moral villain of the story, something that becomes more evident as the antagonist L is more presented and his morality is shown. Light's characteristics are put on full display. He has no remorse on just taking this life who just simply opposed him. In fact, he laughs at it like a maniac. And again, as the story continues onward, we get to see more of Light Yagami's god complex and his lack of sympathy for human life. But L kind of uses this as some sort of trap. Now, seeing that Kira is capable of murdering people that he's seen on TV and knowing their name, he sort of dares Kira to kill him. But since he's incapable of, what L is trying to deduce is how in the world and what is Kira needing in order to take a life. Essentially, the method of murder and the source from which the murder came from. And through Light Yagami's outburst, L is able to deduce where Kira is located and the possibilities of how he's doing this. So instantly, Light is given a challenge unlike anything else he had before. Because at first he's given a challenge of morality, but now he's given an equal in terms of intelligence, and they're both determined to take each other down. And what I love is at the end of Chapter 2 is we get Ryuk's reaction, and it's very similar to what we, the reader, would be thinking. This is nothing but a riot. This is incredibly interesting, and I can't wait to see how this ends up. In a way, Ryuk is kind of a representation of the reader, or the viewer if you were seeing the anime, watching everything unfold in front of their eyes. So Chapter 1 ends up presenting a lot of questions, ideas, as well as establishing the setting of the story, and Chapter 2 instantly establishes conflict. Not only some sort of moral conflict, but an equal to Light Yagami, somebody who can personally challenge him on an individual level. And this is really one of the, if not the essential thing as to what makes Death Note so interesting, and a lot of stories that we love interesting. Just to give a few examples, whenever you have a character who's given some sort of opposition, usually the opposition and the conflict becomes a lot more intriguing when it's personal. There's more drama, there's more elements of personality mixed into it, and at times we get to see the character challenge each other's morality and their goals in life. For example, you have Joe Yabuki versus Rikishi. These are two people that, in a way, they're kind of demonstrating the way that they chose to live their life within the boxing ring. But they're both people who push each other to the brink of what they're capable of physically, eventually resulting in the doom of one of the characters earlier than another. But nonetheless, it's the best rivalry that the series has to offer because these are characters that have been intertwined personally for a very long time within the narrative. Dr. Tenma versus Johan. This is a conflict of worldview and ideology. Tenma believing in the value of human life and that no human life should be valued over another, and Johan believing that no human life has any sort of value to begin with. And I won't get into Guts and Griffith because it'd be annoying at this point. But when one brings up the conversation of best protagonist versus antagonist dynamics, greatest 1-2 punches, L versus Light is one of the prime examples, and that's because of how quickly Death Note tries to establish this within the narrative, and how it manages to pull it off perfectly. And so without even knowing what he looks like, his personality in reality, we're already given a challenge to the protagonist of our story, morally and intellectually, not physically. Once again, all of this established 2 chapters into the story. Chapter 3 opens up a little oddly, now going back to the element of chaos being the Shinigami world and the rules regarding all of that. And then we find out that Ryuk actually has 2 Death Notes, something that will play more into a factor later on within the story, but yet again, it's the author throwing another mystery at us, another possible element that'll completely alter the events of this story and the dynamic that was just established in Chapter 2. I've noticed with all of the thriller stories that I've read that really try to keep the intrigue there, a really good method is that they throw in elements that could possibly be more chaotic to the story. What do I mean? Things and characters that will possibly alter the actions of the protagonist or antagonist, or the actions of their own will affect said characters that I just mentioned. And Chapter 3 does this again, not only with the Shinigami world, but the supposed advantage that Light says that he has. and we instantly find out the mystery that one of the main ones trying to bring down Kira is his own father, as he opens the door and he welcomes his father home, showing where Kira is able to get, or well, Light is able to get some of the information that is so valuable to him, staying one step ahead from the police and from L. And then once again, Light's morality is instantly put into perspective when he says that if he messes up, he's gonna have to kill his own family, showing very little emotion when saying this, although this could be him trying to hide it. Again, in 3 chapters, we've had the protagonist of our story's morality put into question, established, and then pushed even further, showing us his god complex and his lack of remorse for human life, seeing that his goal is more important than those it affects. Once again, establishing a character that believes that the ends justify the means. And that type of character is always interesting, considering the moral debate surrounding that ideology in the first place. Now, Chapter 4 is where we get to see the story moving forward after all of these things have been established in the first 3 chapters of the story. We get to see the police moving forward with their investigation along with L, but as Light begins to put the picture even more vividly in our minds, being the relationship between human beings and how the police are going to be investigating L and vice versa, and L doing everything in his power to crack down on who the possible suspects could be regarding this Kira. Really, Chapter 4 is just the story moving forward, showing us the intelligence once again of L and of Light with his booby trap for the Death Note in case someone were to open the drawer, and all of the things and possible relationships between the police and L and everybody that's already been established within the story. Now we move on to Chapter 5. I would classify Chapter 5 the same way that I would classify Chapter 3. Sort of these game-changing information chapters where we're thrown another bone into the mix that completely alter what could possibly happen to the outcome of the story. As I think as we can see very early on, and this is a pattern that would continue throughout especially the early portions of Death Note, is chapters that further push what we already know and what has already been established, and things that completely change what have been established, or at least the impact of said things. And this isn't just in Death Note, this is in every story. But in Chapter 5 of Death Note, this game-changing thing now goes back to our element of chaos, the Shinigami, more specifically Ryuk, and the rules as I mentioned in Chapter 1 that were already put into question. What else don't we know, or what haven't we been told yet? And well, in the beginning of Chapter 5, we instantly get the alignment of Ryuk, as he says he's not on Light's side or L's. He's just sort of this spectator watching. However, just because it's been bugging him personally, there's somebody who's been watching Light Yagami's back this entire time, instantly throwing in this other mysterious character who could possibly be L at this point, but visually looks a little different from what we've seen so far. So once again, this whole other person has been thrown into the mix that needs to be dealt with. But then Ryuk really drops the big bomb of information, the game-changing moment within this chapter. And that's the relationship of the Shinigami and the humans, and more so a look into the Shinigami's behavior and why they do what they do, sharing that Shinigami actually gain extra life from humans whenever they die, some sort of exchange. And in reality, to the Shinigami, what happens in the human world doesn't matter at all. The only thing that matters is that they continue to live onwards. However, there's been Shinigami that just sat around and didn't do anything, so they ended up dying. Ryuk seeing that as very boring and meaningless existence, probably pointing as to why he dropped the Death Note in the human world, not only for his own lifespan, but also for his own entertainment in a so far meaningless existence in his world. But even then, the real game changer comes when Ryuk establishes the clear difference between humans and Shinigami, being that Shinigami gain extra life from the lives taken from humans, but humans don't gain that. And the other main difference being the Shinigami's eyes, being that a Shinigami is able to see a human's name and lifespan over their head when they look at somebody. And furthermore, it is possible for a human to gain the eyes of a Shinigami, just that it would cost them half of their lifespan. In my opinion, this is nothing short of a genius move by the author, introducing something that the protagonist needs possibly in order to accomplish the mission in the moment of desperation, but adding a consequence so severe that it almost would seem out of question. So now, whenever there's any moment in the story that's incredibly tense, or the possibility of Light Yagami being figured out by somebody who he doesn't know the name of, then this possibility of trading half of his lifespan becomes a possibility. It's something that's added there as the ultimate failsafe in case things go wrong, only adding more tension and possible conflict to a story that is already tense enough. So this is what's been established within the first 5 chapters of Death Note. Our protagonist Light Yagami is somebody who clearly is morally questionable, and seems to have a bit of a god complex. Somebody who seems to have very little sympathy or remorse for human life, which could be the characteristics of possibly a psychopath. And so even though early on in the story it seems like his actions are for the greater good, his personality and his character shows that he's somebody who could be incredibly dangerous, and this could go south at any moment, being that all he needs to really kill somebody is to know their name and their face. It's also established that the police are on his ass, and the one person who can challenge him intellectually so far within the story is somebody who he doesn't know the name or the appearance of. And this person now knows that Kira needs to know the appearance and the name of this person in order to cause damage, instantly establishing an equal and an antagonist towards Light. We also know that Light Yagami's father is also trying to figure out who this Kira is, therefore Light has this instant access to information, but he's also dangerously close to somebody who could figure him out. And in case anything goes wrong, he could possibly do this deal where he gives up half of his lifespan in order to instantly see the name and lifespan of somebody else when he looks at them. Also, despite the police and L both trying to figure out who this Kira is, the police and L are also mistrusting of each other. I genuinely don't think you can come up with a better start for a psychological thriller like Death Note. And this only ramps itself up further and further and further as the story goes on within the first 20-so chapters of Death Note. Now, this could all be attributed to Death Note having pretty fast pacing, obviously, but when a story is able to establish that much and continue to add upon its tension as a thriller to that extent, I genuinely don't see many stories having a better start than Death Note, in my personal opinion. Not to say that there aren't stories with great, phenomenal starts. Let's not do that. But genuinely, I think if I had to point to the best start that I've seen to a story, I'd point to Death Note, for all that it's able to establish in that short amount of time in the beginning. A bit of a longer analysis video for me. I usually don't really go in depth into something like that just because it's not really me, but this was the topic that I was feeling like really passionate about spontaneously. Hopefully you enjoyed the video though, and if you are new to the channel, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and turning on the bell notifications. That way you're notified whenever a new video pops up on some of your favorite anime, manga, or whatever content. As always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.